everyone. I'm sorry I can't be in beautiful Glastonbury with you in person, but I'm delighted in this online format to have the chance to share with you some thoughts and ideas about a mythical character from the British and Irish traditions who is very, very close to my heart, the Cailleach, the archetypical Old Woman of the world in our mythology. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about the ways in which these old stories can teach us about ways in which to find the archetypical old woman in our places. I'm recording this on a beautiful hot summer's day and I have the window wide open for comfort, so if there are any noises, I hope you will understand. First of all, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background about who the Cailleach is for those of you who are not already familiar with her. And I'd say that although a lot of attention has been paid to the question of all of the ways in which the European countries back in the day were worshipping what we have come to call the Great Mother Goddess, actually, in this part of the world, we were honouring a Great Grandmother Goddess. And it's important to say that in neither Celtic nor British folk tradition or mythology does there exist a creation myth which explains the creation of the universe. But the mythology of the Cailleach tells us a lot about the shaping and the creation of the land, because she was the old woman who created and shaped the land throughout all of its ages. She was kind of a geological force and the oldest of the old. And she's perhaps the best known of a multitude of giant old women who are scattered through the myth and folklore of Britain and the wider Europe traditions. And folklorists have actually suggested that she was probably a pre-Celtic deity who persisted into the Celtic era. And the ubiquity of her folklore suggests that she has really strongly persisted in the oral tradition all the way through the ages, right up until modern times. She is one of the few old deities that we know of whose folklore and mythology has persisted for such a very long time. Now, although the word Cailleach in modern Scottish and Irish Gaelic simply means old woman, for reasons I won't bore you with, it's believed to derive originally from the Latin word pallium, which means veil. So the Cailleach is quite literally the veiled one. We don't know why, we don't know in what context that veil appeared, but that seems to have been her original name. What we do know is that stories exist about several otherworldly old women who bear variants of her name throughout Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and it's not always apparent whether they relate just to one single, very widely travelled Cailleach, or a wider group of deities who would be known as Cailleachin, or the plural of the word Cailleach. In Ireland, the most commonly occurring Cailleach is called the Cailleach Vera, a name which is believed to derive from the Beara Peninsula, though many scholars think it actually doesn't. In the Isle of Man, she's most often called the Cailleach ní Gromach, the Old Woman of the Gloom, or sometimes the Cailleach ní Gweshag, Old Woman of the Spells. And in one old poem, she's referred to as Berry Down. In Ulster folklore, she's known as Calleagh, and in some of the folk tales of the Scottish lowlands, she's called Beara, or known as the Jaya Carlin, a very terrifying and often malevolent witch figure. Stories about the Cailleach then occur in all regions of Scotland and Ireland, and they're very deeply embedded in the landscape. And the stories are usually associated with very wild and rocky places, and so are the place names that are associated with the Cailleach. They usually attach to mountains or rocky ridges or to places in which ancient dolmens and cairns are to be found. And this is how I first came across the Cailleach, who has had a major impact on my life and my thinking. In 2003, I moved to a 7-acre croft in the northwest Highlands of Scotland, the country where my father and all of his family were from, and I discovered stories about her there for the very first time. In 2010, cutting a long story short, I moved to another croft on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. And I wrote about that journey, some of you may be familiar with it, in my book, If Women Rose Rooted. But for those of you who don't know about it, during those days, I would spend hours outside each day in all weathers, tending to the vegetables, doing my work on the croft, and whatever else might be going on in the house or out on the land or in my work. Twice a day, I was down on the headland and the beaches walking the dogs, because the pull of that very radical land was really like a drug, and I found it very difficult to be without it, to be locked inside. So because we lived in a very remote place, there was a small community, it was quite inward looking. Most of the time there was only me and the dogs out there on the land. And because there were so few people and I was quite lonely, I began to talk to the land. And very specifically, I began to talk to the Cailleach as I walked, because her stories and names, place names bearing her name, were so firmly embedded in that landscape. Now, in the mountains to the front of our house, filling the view from pretty much every window, you could see the reclining figure of a woman with her hair rippling out in long waves and one arm thrown behind her back. And there are other places throughout the islands and highlands of Scotland where the shapes of specific mountains or specific mountain ranges are believed to represent the silhouette of the old goddess of the land. Now, the best known of these is Lewis's Sleeping Beauty mountain, which can be seen from the Cailleach stone circle. It's actually a range of hills, not a single one. And what's interesting is, even though it's called the Sleeping Beauty in English, in Scottish Gaelic, she is called the Cailleach the Old Woman of the Moors. And I looked out then onto our own reclining goddess in the hills every morning when I opened the bedroom curtains, and she kind of dominated the landscape around us. And I whispered all of my hopes and fears to her every day as I walked that headland with the dogs. She was always there. She was a constant and very vivid reminder of the divine feminine in the landscape, which still persists in Irish and Scottish mythology and folklore. So in the Western Isles, the stories tell of the Cailleach's two aspects: Bridget, known there as Bride, and the hard, very stony, blue-faced Cailleach of Scottish folklore. One version of the story says that the Old Woman of Winter, the Cailleach, she's associated with the winter in Scottish mythology, dies and is reborn as Bride, the Spring Maiden, every year at Imbolc. She's very fragile at first, but then she grows and she gains strength throughout the summer until, as autumn approaches, she begins to fade and to weaken again, and her sister, the Cailleach, begins to awaken. And by the time that Samhain comes around, it is the Cailleach who rules the season and Bride who is asleep. And there are many stories in that folk tradition about the battle for the seasons which takes place between Bride and the Cailleach, but they can certainly be seen as two aspects of life in balance, as representing the cycles and seasons, not just of the year, but of our lives. Now, the silhouette of the woman opposite our house looked very much like a young woman. To me, she represented Bride, but I found her sister, or her alter ego, the Cailleach, by accident one day when haunting a piece of the shoreline that nobody really visited, and I kind of stumbled by mistake on a remarkable location which I only ever afterwards called the Rocky Place. And it was my place. I recognised it as such from the very first moment I saw it. There were vast expanses of very smooth, slabbed rock, like a kind of multicoloured layered carpet, which sloped all the way down to the sea. And it was made primarily of Lewisian gneiss, which is one of the oldest rocks in the world. And so it wasn't very surprising that in that old rock, I should find in the corner of a cliff face the very rough-hewn silhouette of an old woman, slightly larger than human height, standing, looking out to sea, the Cailleach, because the old stories tell us that she is given to standing in such places, looking out to sea for the return of her husband, sometimes called the Bodach, or the Old Man, and sometimes identified in folklore as Manannán mac Lia, an old deity who was associated with the sea in both the Irish and the Manx traditions. And just around the corner from this Cailleach silhouette, I found a vast flat stone slab wedged into the cliff face that looked for all the world like a sofa bed, and I called it the Cailleach's bed. And in August, when I was tired of 2 light nights and I wanted to see the stars again, I used to sleep out there. To be able to see the night sky in all its glory. And so directly out of the land and the features of the landscape there, I found the old woman, I found the Cailleach, or perhaps she found me, and she became part of my life. And my life became part of her and part of the land, just as she and the stories were part of the land. And I called this strange sensation of being immersed in a mythical landscape, falling into the land's dreaming. That I and the land felt in some way inseparable. Walking the land, then I was immersing myself in those stories, and I sat there quite often in that rocky place with my legs crossed, looking out to sea, imagining the long, lonely ages of the Cailleach waiting for her husband to return. And it taught me pretty much everything I needed to know about endurance and about standing your ground. And so when we left that place 4 years later for Donegal in the west of Ireland, it was one of the most difficult things that I have ever done. I felt as if I were betraying the Cailleach by leaving her alone there once again. After we moved to Donegal, it took us a full 18 months to sell our old house in Croft. And when finally we found a buyer, my husband had to go back to Lewis to fetch the remaining things that we had left in the sheds around the croft. And I asked him to go to the rocky place and to say hello for me. And he did. And when he went there, he found that the vast stone slab, which was the mattress of the Cailleach's bed, had completely vanished. And yes, we do have photographic evidence to prove it. There are big storms in the islands, and yes, big storms can move rocks. But this rock was jammed right into that cliff face. It was enormous. It was bigger in its dimensions than a single bed, lifting it completely out of that alcove in which it so tightly fit. Under some circumstances, perhaps, and yet just this one particular rock seemed impossible to me to move. And you may wonder what I'm trying to tell you here, whether I'm filled with delusions of grandeur and think that just because I left Lewis, the Cailleach's bed was spit out. Maybe because the land was angry at me, maybe because the land actually was grieving for me as I grieved for it. But either way, there are, as I'm sure you all are very much aware, things that happen that don't have a simple causal explanation, what Carl Jung used to call synchronicities. I'm sure I don't need to justify such things to you. But back to Donegal. When we moved there, we were moving from a place where the Cailleach was steeped in the landscape and where I'd been able to immerse myself into her stories and to feel that she was there, she was immanent in that land. And although much of Ireland is steeped in the mythology of the Cailleach, I seem to have managed to move to the one part of Donegal where I could find no stories at all about the Cailleach. And I was really quite distraught. She had become so much a part of my life, and particularly moving there to a new place where I was still slowly making friends, I felt as if I'd lost the greatest friend and teacher that I had ever had. And so I set about wondering where I could find the Cailleach in this place. If there were no existing stories, where might I find her anyway? Because I had grown so used to looking for her. I didn't feel as if I could properly belong to a place at that time where there was no Cailleach, because her stories had claimed me so very powerfully. Now, on the hill behind our house, there was a wood, and in the wood there was a heronry. And every morning when I walked the dogs very early along the river that ran in front of our cottage, I would see a heron standing on a stone in the middle of the river. And one morning, as I was walking past, we startled the heron, and she flew off, and I thought to and she shrieked as she flew off, and I thought to myself, goodness me, she sounds for all the world like an old hag. And then I began to remember all of the stories in the Irish and other traditions, the Welsh traditions too, where the heron is associated with old women and often shapeshifts between one form or another. And this is probably one of the reasons why eating a heron's flesh was once forbidden, because from a distance they do, standing on one leg, very tall and gangly, they do look like old women with their arms out at very strange angles. And so I really did feel that I had discovered an iteration of the old woman in that landscape, in that moment. And by the time I had gone for my walk and came back to the house, a character had popped into my head who I called Old Crane Woman. Half woman and half bird. And by the time I arrived home, she'd pretty much taken possession of me, and I felt a particularly strong voice that she had, a very rhythmical voice. And I felt as if that character who had popped into my head was, in a sense, an act of co-creation between me and the land, the heron, the river, the imaginal world, the other world, if you like, that is entangled with the physical world. And I had found the Cailleach in my place, in another form. And here is how I described Old Crane Woman at the time in a series of blogs I wrote about her. Sometimes, if you happen to be walking along a track within reach of water at dusk or at dawn, you'll see her there, Old Crane Woman, a tall, gangly figure wrapped in a mood-grey cloak. Her legs and her arms are unusually long and seem to bend in odd directions. Sometimes you'll find her standing in the river, still as can be, on one leg. You'll know her by her long nose, her frayed grey and white dress, her long, thin arms with the sharp, sticking-out elbows. Don't startle her. She'll be gone in a flash. So that figure of Old Crane Woman was new in the ever-transforming mythology of that particular corner of Donegal, but she emerged in the only way that is meaningful, in my view, not just out of my head, not really just written down in an old book or a piece of paper, but out of my relationship with the land. And she is a typical example of how the land can draw us into relationship with us. And this is also a very clear example of how we can find new examples of an old archetype in a new place where stories of them don't already exist. And I'm going to put this in Jungian language rather than in a spiritual language, talking about the Cailleach as an example of an archetype. Now, an archetype is a fundamental idea. The old woman of the world is an archetype, something that can't be reduced, something which we all recognize. But the archetypes wear different clothing, if you like, in different cultures, so that in the Native American tradition, the old woman of the world might be Grandmother Spider. In our tradition, she might be the Cailleach. They wear different clothes for the different culture, for the different locations, for the different places. Archetypes are Carl Jung's word for what Plato, many centuries earlier, called ideas or forms. And in Plato's work, these archetypes had an independent existence. They weren't, as Jung believed for a while, part of the human psyche. And this is similar to an old Sufi concept of what is called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, in which the Sufis believed that there existed between the physical plane, the physical world, and the world of the intellect, there existed an imaginal world, which was where archetypal beings lived, where synchronicities came from, where stories came from. In many ways, it was like a kind of version of our Celtic otherworld, entangled with the physical world, but slightly separate from it. And the idea was that archetypal beings lived in this place, lived in this imaginal world, and kind of happened to us across the veil from time to time. But the important thing about the archetypal beings that live in the imaginal world, according to these old traditions, is that they're not static, they're not fixed in stone. They have their own process of becoming. They grow and change, just like we do. They change the clothes they wear. They change the way they present themselves to us, just as the world changes and we become different and have different concerns and tell different stories indeed. So I felt as if I had found a kind of version of the Cailleach who was pretty much up to date for that particular part of Donegal where I lived, that it was really Old Crane Woman was the Cailleach wearing different clothes. And I think this is one of the lessons that I love to talk about in my writing and in my teaching and in my courses, that if you live in a place where the Cailleach in her original form doesn't belong, because she is a creature of the wind and the rain, she's a creature of the wild and the rocky places. You won't find the Cailleach in the New Mexico desert, but you will find the old woman there. And I think for those of us who are part of this tradition in which the Cailleach appears, the tradition of Britain and Ireland, I think for those of us for whom she is part of our lineage, she can teach us, just as she taught me when I found Old Crane Woman, how to find examples of the old woman of the world in our places. So thank you for listening, and I hope I've offered you some ideas for looking to the land for inspiration, because the Cailleach of all of our deities in this part of the world, she is the one who is most rooted in the land. She is the land. She teaches us that to be elder is to be strong like the land and to endure like the land, to be as strong and as hard and as enduring as the oldest rocks of this earth, which she personifies. She tells us that to be elder in our tradition is to be powerful and to stay the course, and to remain fully alive through all of the long years until our work here is done.